The announcement lasted less than a minute, but its consequences reached across generations. Prince William stepped forward, chose his words with extraordinary care, and confirmed that Princess Charlotte would become the crown's first royal youth. Ambassador, a newly created role, placing his daughter beside him at selected charitable and ceremonial engagements. Nobody applauded immediately. Behind the palace doors, stunned faces revealed one terrifying truth. This decision had changed the royal future. William let the silence settle across the long table at Windsor Castle. Catherine watched Charlotte with pride and fear. Charles lowered his eyes toward the documented briefing while Camilla remained still. The Royal Youth Ambassador, he explained, was a supervised position representing children's well-being, education, and community service. It would not change the line of succession, the legal order determining who inherits the throne, but it would give his daughter a public voice, unlike any granted to a royal child before her. Charlotte felt every face turned toward her. She had wanted to help, yet the weight of becoming part of the monarchy's future suddenly felt cold. Catherine reached beneath the table and held her hand. The princess understood how quickly service could become sacrifice, and she refused to let applause steal the childhood her daughter deserved. Charles closed the folder with a snap. "Does she truly understand what you are placing on her shoulders?" he asked. William did not retreat. He told the king that Charlotte had requested the responsibility after seeing children struggle to be heard. A recorded conversation preserved her wish. She wanted to stand beside young people, not above them. The monarch looked toward his granddaughter, but his concern remained. William then confirmed the decision that changed Camilla's expression. Charlotte's first supervised appearance would take place beside him at the National Children's Service ceremony, a gathering honouring young volunteers and organisations supporting them. The Queen Consort asked why her household had not reviewed the arrangement. He answered that Catherine and he had approved it through their foundation, drawing a boundary around the next generation. Camilla heard the message. Authority was shifting, and the future king was no longer waiting for permission to shape his family's destiny. Yet Charlotte noticed the struggle around her. As chairs moved and courtiers departed, she saw Charles remain seated alone, one hand resting on the closed file. Charlotte paused at the doorway. Her grandfather's silence was not anger, it was fear. And before she could understand its source, she would have to confront what this honour demanded from everyone she loved. To the public, Charlotte had suddenly become a symbol of royal renewal. To William, she was still the daughter whose hand he instinctively reached for in crowded rooms. That contradiction made the new appointment both inspiring and dangerous. One part of him believed she could give young people a genuine voice. Another remembered what relentless attention had done to his own childhood, and feared he was opening the same door for her. Charlotte had shown unusual confidence during public ceremonies, yet her parents had fought to keep the rest of her life ordinary. She attended school, followed familiar routines, and returned home without being treated like a working royale term, describing a family member who regularly performed official duties for the crown. Her new position threatened that careful balance, because even limited service could create expectations that followed her everywhere. William carried memories Catherine could never fully share. Cameras had watched him grieve, grow, and struggle before he understood how to protect himself from public judgment. She had entered royal life as an adult and knew what it felt like to be examined, but he had experienced that pressure as a child. Their different histories led them toward the same fear. Charlotte might succeed brilliantly while suffering silently. William waited until the family sat together without advisors. He leaned toward his daughter and asked whether she felt frightened by what was coming. Charlotte looked down before admitting that she did. Then she lifted her eyes and said, "Fear should not stop me from helping children who believed adults never listened." The prince heard courage in those words, but he also heard innocence, and that frightened him more. Catherine moved beside her daughter and knelt close enough to hold both her hands. She promised that the role would never come before school, privacy, or happiness. Charlotte gripped her mother tightly, exposing the excitement and vulnerability she had tried to hide. The princess felt proud, yet she understood that one successful engagement could encourage the palace to demand another, then another, until a voluntary duty became an obligation. Charles deepened that unease during a recorded private conversation with William. He said Charlotte's natural composure reminded him of the late Queen, whose calm sense of duty had defined an entire reign. The king intended it as praise, but the comparison shook his son. Elizabeth had inspired millions, yet she had also surrendered much of her private self to the crown. William later opened a sealed planning note, a confidential proposal, kept closed until senior family approval, and discovered that Charlotte's responsibilities could expand gradually. The document described future youth visits, charitable meetings, and carefully supervised appearances. This was no longer one symbolic ceremony. Someone had already imagined an entire path, Then Charles mentioned the forgotten incident that had inspired it all. William's expression changed immediately. During one crowded ceremony, Charlotte had acted while experienced adults remained frozen, and that single moment had convinced her father that she possessed something the palace could neither teach nor ignore. The decision did not begin in a strategy meeting or inside a leather-bound palace file. It began when a frightened child in a public crowd lost sight of his family, and Charlotte noticed before anyone else did. What followed lasted only seconds, yet William never forgot it. While officials hesitated and cameras continued recording, his daughter stepped toward the confusion with a calmness that exposed an instinct far beyond ceremonial training. Months earlier, Charlotte had arrived beside William and Catherine, expecting nothing more than a quiet, supporting appearance. The youth service ceremony was an official gathering created to honour schoolchildren, community volunteers, and charities working in education and mental health. Her parents believed it offered a safe introduction to public duty because she would remain beside them throughout the reception. Nobody expected the day to become the turning point behind her new role. Noise filled the hall as groups moved between tables and invited guests waited to speak with the royal family. Then one young boy became separated from his teacher. He searched the crowd, called out once and froze when nobody answered. Several officials noticed the disturbance, but uncertainty held them back. Charlotte saw something else. She recognised fear. Charlotte moved before an aide could stop her. She approached the child, asked his name, and told him he was not alone. The boy struggled to speak, so she remained beside him and gently asked where he had last seen his teacher. Seconds later, an aide located the woman and reunited them. Relief replaced panic. But the young royal's simple response had already changed the atmosphere around her. Catherine felt pride rise sharply and then fear. Her daughter had acted with genuine compassion. Yet the princess understood how quickly the palace could turn one natural gesture into a permanent expectation. William felt the same conflict. He later admitted in a recorded private conversation that Charlotte's kindness had moved him, but it also reminded him how easily duty could begin before a child understood its cost. William requested a confidential assessment immediately after the ceremony. The assessment was a private review used to judge whether limited public responsibilities would be safe, suitable, and emotionally manageable. He asked whether Charlotte could attend carefully controlled youth engagements without surrendering her education or private life. That request became the first formal step toward creating the Royal Youth Ambassador position. Charlotte's own words gave the proposal its purpose. A documented account written by the event coordinator recorded her asking, "Who listens to children when the adults are busy?" William read that sentence repeatedly. The prince no longer saw only a compassionate moment. He saw a voice capable of reaching young people who felt invisible. Charles initially approved the idea during a private meeting, believing it meant one or two symbolic appearances. The king's support changed when the full proposal reached his desk and revealed a gradual path of expanding responsibilities. He closed the file, summoned his son, and demanded an explanation. What began as admiration for one compassionate gesture was about to become a fierce argument over childhood duty and the crown's right to claim both. The door closed, the aides remained outside, and two future visions of monarchy confronted each other across a small table. King Charles feared that Charlotte was being drawn into duty too soon. William believed shielding her completely would teach her that service was something to fear. Neither man raised his voice at first, but when the king mentioned the scars of William's own childhood, the conversation stopped being constitutional. It became painfully personal. Charles had summoned his son after reading the final engagement schedule at Windsor. He had expected one carefully supervised ceremony, yet the pages described charity visits, youth meetings, and future appearances. A named royal role meant an officially recognised position tied directly to the crown, not merely a child accompanying her parents. Once the public accepted Charlotte in that position, withdrawing her could look like failure, punishment, or hidden crisis. William understood the danger, but he refused to let fear make the decision. The prince argued that young people would recognise honesty in someone closer to their own generation. Charlotte would remain supervised, continue her education, and accept only limited responsibilities. Yet the monarch saw a trap. Public affection could become public ownership, and admiration could turn into a demand no family boundary could contain. Charles leaned forward and spoke with sudden force. "I will not watch another royal child become public property." William pushed his chair back. "She is my daughter before she is anyone's symbol," he answered. The words struck the room like a warning. The king had questioned the plan, but his son heard something deeper, a challenge to his judgment as a father. Charles reminded him that good intentions had never protected him or Harry from childhood scrutiny. William stiffened. The mention of his brother reopened memories neither man could control. Grief measured by cameras. Private pain turned into headlines. Two boys expected to remain composed. Harry had carried those wounds into adulthood, while the future king had buried his beneath duty. Now both histories stood between father and son. William reached into his folder and produced Charlotte's handwritten request. The letter gave the revelation a source no courtier could dismiss. Her own words. She wrote that she wanted to help frightened children feel noticed, but she also demanded a private withdrawal clause, a written protection allowing her to stop if the role harmed her education, privacy, or happiness. Charles read the letter twice. His anger weakened when he reached the final line where his granddaughter wrote that service should never require someone to stop being themselves. The monarch placed the page carefully on the table and admitted that Charlotte understood more than he had expected. Yet Charles did not surrender completely. He agreed that the appointment could continue, but demanded to know who had designed its protections and who would control the influence created by Charlotte's public presence. William held his gaze before answering with one name: Catherine. The argument had exposed the family's fear, but the next battle would reveal the quiet machinery and the unexpected ally behind William's decision. William delivered the announcement, but Catherine built the boundaries that made it possible. While the palace debated titles, precedents, and headlines, she focused on one question: how could Charlotte serve without surrendering her childhood? Her answer was not sentimental. It was precise, fiercely protective, and strong enough to overrule experienced courtiers. The person holding the real power was not the loudest figure in the room. It was the mother who refused to negotiate her daughter's safety. Catherine had already studied every risk before Charles challenged his son. Precedents, the formal order deciding where royal family members stand during official events, meant little to her compared with Charlotte's well-being. She drafted a limited framework with William. No solo appearances, no political subjects, no interference with schooling, and only a small number of supervised engagements each year. The rules mattered because one successful appearance could tempt officials to demand more. William placed the framework under the Royal Foundation, the charitable organisation through which he and his wife managed long-term public projects. That decision gave the parents direct control over Charlotte's schedule, causes, and emotional support. It also prevented the traditional palace household from expanding her duties without their approval. The future king understood the message clearly. His daughter would serve the crown, but she would not belong to it. Catherine faced resistance during a private planning meeting. A senior courtier argued that an official royal role must answer to the institution rather than personal family wishes. The advisor warned that allowing Charlotte to withdraw freely could weaken the authority surrounding the appointment. Catherine closed the folder. Her role may serve the institution, she replied, but her childhood does not belong to any institution. The courtier fell silent, realising she would not bend. Catherine later sat beside Charlotte and explained what the written protections truly meant. Bravery, she told her, did not always mean walking into a crowded room. Sometimes bravery meant saying no, stepping back, or admitting that something had become too heavy. Charlotte felt relief break through her anxiety. She had feared accepting the appointment would remove her right to refuse, but her mother had protected that choice before anyone could challenge it. Catherine recorded those safeguards in the final documented framework. Either parent or Charlotte herself could cancel any appearance without permission from the sovereign's household. The team that supports the reigning monarch's official work. William approved every clause. Together, they had created something rare inside royal life: duty with an escape door. Camilla discovered the limits through a confidential copy of the framework. The Queen Consort searched for her supervisory authority and found none. She read the pages again, then learned that the programme would answer only to William and Catherine. Her exclusion carried an unmistakable warning. The next reign was already beginning to take shape, and she had no control over its youngest new voice. Then invitations bearing Charlotte's designation left Windsor. One reached Camilla's household without consultation, turning private exclusion into a visible humiliation. The safeguards protected Charlotte from the institution, but they could not protect the family from the resentment now spreading inside it. The announcement was barely public before the palace began dividing into camps. Some saw Charlotte as living proof that the monarchy could speak to a younger generation. Others saw a child being positioned at the centre of a succession strategy. But the sharpest reaction came from Camilla. When an embossed invitation arrived carrying the new designation, she read the wording once, removed her glasses, and understood that a boundary had been drawn around the future crown. Palace staff moved quickly to control the confusion. They revised briefing documents, engagement protocols, and press guidance before speculation could harden into accepted truth. Engagement protocols were the official rules controlling how a royal appearance would operate, while press guidance told spokespeople how to explain it publicly. Every page stressed the same point. Charlotte's role was charitable and ceremonial, not constitutional. She would represent young people, but she had received no new legal power. George remained the direct heir after William, meaning he still stood next in the succession after his father. Charlotte's position had not changed. Yet visibility created a different kind of influence. The young princess now possessed a public identity beyond simply being the heir's sister, and that new balance could either strengthen the siblings or invite the palace to compare them. Camilla carried the invitation directly to Charles. She asked why she had learned the final wording through an envelope rather than from her husband. Her voice remained controlled, but wounded pride sharpened every sentence. The Queen Consort believed the exclusion had been deliberate. The king did not deny it. A recorded private conversation preserved his admission that William wanted parental control kept completely separate from her household. Charles answered with sadness instead of anger. He had approved the arrangement because he could not demand trust from his son while denying him authority as a father. The monarch reminded Camilla that Charlotte's safety mattered more than household influence. She looked back at the invitation and understood that he had chosen William's boundaries over her involvement. Charlotte discovered the fallout by accident. Walking past a half-closed doorway, she heard two courtiers questioning whether she was being prepared as a spare voice beside George. One advisor suggested her popularity could support the heir. The other warned it might eventually overshadow him. The words struck harder than open criticism. Her appointment had been created to help children, yet the palace was already turning it into a contest between siblings. William learned what had happened through Charlotte's tearful account. He summoned both courtiers, removed them from the youth programme, and cancelled an early press briefing they had helped prepare. The prince made the consequence immediate. Anyone treating his children as rival instruments would lose access to the project. Charlotte still carried the phrase with her that evening. She found George, asked whether they could speak without their parents, and closed the door behind them. The palace had treated the siblings as positions in a hierarchy. Behind that closed door, George and Charlotte were about to answer as brother and sister. There were no advisors, briefing folders, or carefully rehearsed statements. When Charlotte sat opposite George, she feared he would see her new role as an intrusion into the future prepared for him since birth. Instead, her brother confessed something she had never expected. He was relieved. For years, George had silently wondered whether duty would eventually separate him from everyone he loved. Charlotte's appointment made him feel that he would not face that future alone. George had been introduced gradually to the responsibilities waiting ahead, but every lesson carried an unspoken message. He was the heir, the person expected to inherit the throne after William, and one day his private choices could affect the entire monarchy. His parents protected him from premature demands, yet they could not erase the knowledge of what his position meant. Even ordinary mistakes might someday be judged as signs of the king he would become. Charlotte's appointment created a different path. She would focus on children's voices, education, and community service, without competing for her brother's constitutional position. Yet the cruel phrase she had overheard still followed her. She told George that she would withdraw immediately if the role made his burden heavier or caused the palace to compare them. George shook his head. Her presence, he said, made the burden feel lighter. He admitted during their private conversation that he sometimes feared becoming known only as a future king rather than as a son, brother, or ordinary boy. The confession stunned Charlotte. She had imagined him feeling secure in his place, but he had been carrying the same fear of losing himself that now haunted her. Charlotte reached across the space between them and promised she would remind him who he was whenever ceremonial expectations became overwhelming. Ceremonial expectations were the public behaviours and formal duties demanded during royal events. Even when someone felt frightened or exhausted, George smiled, then asked her to make one promise stronger than any palace rule. George and Charlotte agreed that neither would allow courtiers to turn them into rivals for attention, status, or public approval. If one heard a comparison, that sibling would speak directly to the other before believing it. If either felt pushed aside, they would say so privately. The palace might measure precedence, popularity, and succession, but brother and sister would measure loyalty. William had approached the room quietly and heard only the final words. Charlotte promised she would never stand against George, and her brother promised he would never ask her to stand behind him. The prince stopped outside the door. Rather than interrupting, he stepped away with tears in his eyes, finally certain that the appointment had united his children instead of dividing them. William later told them that Charlotte's first appearance would proceed as planned. Pride replaced some of the fear inside the family, but a harder test remained. Private promises could protect the siblings from palace games. They could not control cameras, headlines, or millions of public judgments. Charlotte took George's hand before leaving the room. The choice between them had been made. What had been settled quietly between two children was about to be judged loudly by millions. By sunrise, Charlotte's name dominated broadcasts, front pages, and conversations far beyond the palace gates. Yet the public argument changed when she arrived at the National Children's Service beside William. She did not deliver a grand speech. She simply stopped beside a nervous young volunteer, listened without interruption, and handed the child her own programme after he misplaced his. One unguarded gesture became the image through which the country understood her appointment. Broadcasters repeated the safeguards before the engagement began. Charlotte held no constitutional authority, meaning she had received no legal power to make decisions for the crown, and she would receive no salary or independent schedule. Her position remained a supervised charitable role designed around her age, education, and emotional well-being. Those limits mattered because the palace needed to prove that service had not quietly replaced childhood. Commentators still divided sharply. Some praised William and Catherine for creating a modern family approach that allowed their daughter to help without becoming a full-time working royal. Others questioned whether any child should carry a formal public designation. Every argument returned to the same fear. Once the country loved Charlotte in the role, could she ever leave without disappointing millions? Charlotte felt that pressure before the car door opened. She admitted to William that her hands were shaking and asked whether everyone would notice. The prince told her courage was not stillness, it was choosing kindness while afraid. His answer steadied her because he did not demand perfection. He gave her permission to feel fear without becoming controlled by it. Charlotte entered beside her father and followed the limited programme they had rehearsed. Then the young volunteer lost his copy, stumbled over his prepared words, and looked down in embarrassment. She stopped. Instead of moving toward the next guest, she listened until the child finished speaking and handed him her own programme. The volunteers smiled and the tension surrounding them broke. Catherine watched the broadcast privately. She pressed her fingers to her lips when her daughter paused beside the child, recognising the same instinct that had begun everything months earlier. The princess felt immense pride, but tears followed it. Charlotte had succeeded because she remained herself, yet that success could make the public demand more from her. The next morning delivered the defining verdict. A national newspaper published a front-page photograph of Charlotte listening closely to the volunteer beneath the headline, "A young voice for a new crown." The image did not present her as a rival to George or a symbol controlled by courtiers. It captured a child making another child feel heard. Families gathered outside Windsor Castle carrying handwritten messages about education, mental health, and children who felt ignored. Their presence transformed palace debate into visible public hope. William saw the messages, but he refused to let celebration erase the boundaries Catherine had created. Charlotte returned home exhausted, proud, and uncertain. The world had welcomed her, but she still needed one answer from the people waiting inside. The nation had chosen its symbol. Now the royal family had to decide whether it had protected the child behind that symbol. When Charlotte returned to Windsor, there was no formal reception waiting for her. Charles stood beside Catherine and George, while William remained close enough to see whether the day had exhausted his daughter. The king asked one simple question. Did she still want the role? Charlotte looked at her family, considered everything the announcement had unleashed, and answered yes, but only if she could remain herself. In that moment, the argument was finally settled. William understood what her answer required. The successful engagement had proved Charlotte could serve within the safeguards created by her parents without becoming a full-time working royale, a family member expected to perform official duties throughout the year. She had connected with young people because she acted naturally, not because the palace had trained away her fear. That distinction protected both her purpose and her childhood. Catherine opened the final family agreement and repeated its boundaries. The programme would remain limited, schooling would come first, and every appearance would require Charlotte's continued consent. Either parent could stop an engagement, but their daughter also held that power. The princess reminded her that accepting responsibility once did not mean accepting it forever. Walking away would never be treated as failure. Charles stepped toward his granddaughter with visible regret. He apologised for allowing his memories of wounded royal childhoods to become stronger than his faith in her judgment. The monarch had feared that the crown would claim Charlotte before she understood the cost. Yet she had shown that service could be chosen without surrendering identity. She embraced him, ending the distance that had opened during William's announcement. William then told Charlotte why he was proud. She had not impressed him by remaining perfectly composed or following every prepared instruction. She had impressed him by noticing a frightened volunteer and choosing compassion under pressure. Catherine agreed, warning gently that public praise could be as dangerous as criticism if it persuaded their daughter to ignore exhaustion. Camilla ended the internal struggle through a documented public statement supporting the agreed protections. The Queen Consort acknowledged that the initiative belonged to William and Catherine's household and confirmed that she would not seek supervisory authority. Her acceptance removed the final challenge to the programme and allowed the family to stand behind Charlotte without another battle over control. George moved beside his sister for the family photograph, not ahead of her and not behind her. He stood as the future heir, while Charlotte stood as the young voice she had chosen to become. Their destinies remained separate, but their promise of shared service remained stronger than palace comparisons. Charlotte's appointment had not rewritten the succession or crowned a child before her time. It had revealed a monarchy trying to replace silent obligation with chosen service, protected by consent and guided by compassion. More importantly, it proved that William and Catherine would not sacrifice another childhood merely to satisfy tradition. The announcement began as a palace shock, but it ended with a clear verdict. Charlotte was not being prepared to compete for the crown. She had been trusted to give its youngest generation a voice, and permitted to remain herself while doing it.